Learning is the change in behavior, right? So whether you increase or decrease your behavior based on either experience or associative type of learning processes. And now we're going to focus on memory, and this will probably look a little bit more familiar to what you do in college, because this is the retention of information or experiences over time, okay? And just to start with some of the basics of memory, we know that there's kind of what we call 3 phases. The first one is encoding, and that is getting the memory themselves into the system. So it's the sensations, kind of going back to the conversation about sensations and perceptions. This is when sensations are going in and they're being processed again by the amygdala area of the brain first, and then the higher areas of the brain second. And this is when kind of your executive functioning and your brain works to decide what to do with this information. How should it be put into the system? And then that goes into the storage phase, where the memory is actually stored in the well, we can just put it in these kind of basic terms, stored within the memory systems within our neural network. Okay. And then the other basic is retrieval. Retrieval is based upon how we can get that information back out of the system in order to use it for current experiences. Okay. So again, encoding is getting information in. Storage is putting it in some permanent place, or at least semi-permanent. And retrieval is kind of going to that storage unit and pulling it back out to help explain current experiences. Okay. So again, you'll notice that this sounds very much like a computer model, because the information we're talking about, so we were talking about behaviorism, which paid attention to stimulus response associations. It didn't pay attention to what happens in between. And the cognitive revolution occurred because we understood that there's much more in our mental life that determines behavior than just stimulus response associations. And at the same time, we're looking in the 50s, 60s, and going into the 70s, the big progress, human progress at the time, was the development of the computer and computer system. Okay. So a lot of our memory models are really based upon the computer system. So when we think about encoding, all right, this would be typing on your keyboard or speaking in a microphone, okay? And then when we hit the save button, this would be the storage. And then when we go and try and find that file again, this is what we would call retrieval, okay? And so the model of memory and memory systems we're going to be really talking about are really based upon the computer and computer model. And I would state that each of these have their own storage limitations for a computer. So we'll look at short-term and working memory, and we'll find out that it kind of is equivalent to what's called RAM in your computer. How much information can be processed at one moment in time, okay? In the long-term storage system, we really haven't found the capacity of our long-term memory system. We think it's almost infinite at this point. The issue comes in where it kind of starts to differentiate between storage and retrieval, is that while we think that memories are a permanent aspect of our storage system in the brain, where we get stuck with things like memory loss and those types of issues is in the retrieval process, how to access it. And we'll talk about how that occurs and what really determines whether we're going to retrieve a memory or not, based on its saliency and how deeply processed that information was at the time of storage, okay? When we look at types of input, when we're talking about coding, we know that there's two types, automatic and effortful. So automatic is usually when you're having a highly emotional experience, and emotions are really tied to the situation. You don't actually have to sit and really think about remembering the experience you're having. Okay. Effortful encoding is kind of what we do in college. Okay. I know, you know, a lot of college classes are not very exciting and emotionally charging and those types of things. So we have to put more effort into learning the content. So this is when you're studying your notes at home or your textbook and really trying to make an effort to remember what it is you're studying. Okay. And again, the difference between these two is automatic processing usually requires the situation to be emotionally charged and exciting for the individual. And that's when we know the best kind of automatic encoding occurs. Effortful encoding requires thoughtful processing, really the cognition part of memory. It's that either repeating something over and over and over or making things connected with other things that you remember. And we'll go over different techniques and whatnot to look at how you can improve your effortful encoding. Okay. And in all of this, we got to look at what is the role of attention. So attention is when we are actually looking at something and really identifying and paying close attention to it. Okay. And probably the first type of attention that can be identified is what's called selective attention. Okay. And this is really what we do most of the time is selective attention. It's when we choose to focus on some specific task or some specific aspect of our environment, and that is our main focus. Okay. Probably the best example of selective attention is driving a vehicle. I think I might have mentioned this in this class before. I don't know, everything's blurring at the moment. But with selective attention, if anybody has ever known someone who has been a truck driver for years, decades, let's say, more than likely you'll notice that they have hearing issues. Okay. And really those hearing issues are because of the road noise. And not a lot of people know this, but when we're driving, one of the noisiest moments is when you're on a freeway or within city traffic. And that's actually impinging on the hearing receptors within the ear. And for long-term truck drivers, it's started to damage it. And that's why a lot of truck drivers have hearing issues. But we as normal drivers and stuff, when we're focused on what's ahead of us and we're paying attention to what we need to keep ourselves safe, all of that noise is ignored. Basically, it's not paid attention to. And that's kind of an example of selective attention. I'm hoping all of you have selective attention right now as we go through this course lecture. But one thing that we should note about selective attention is something we call sustained attention right here, this vigilance thing. And these two concepts are important because both of them are purposeful types of attention. Okay, when we're able to sustain or have a purposefully long amount of attention. While we think we do consciously, and I'm hoping that by the end of this lecture, you're going to say, I understood everything. I listened very closely, and I paid attention. While the truth is, and sadly I know this, you'll only remember about 5 to 10% of what we go over today, unless you go back over the material or you have some type of super photogenic memory. Okay. But for the majority of us, we have the ability to attend for about 15 to 20 seconds. And then we disappear somewhere for about 5 to 10 seconds before we bring ourselves back to what we're actually attending to. So in reality, when you have a 1 hour lecture, you actually only purposely attend to about 10 minutes of it. Now we don't know this on the conscious level, but one of the reasons this is happening is when you're paying purposeful attention to something, it's kind of what you'd call burning out the cells that are firing. And so those cells have to calm down, as you would say, before it can attend again. So basically what's happening in your head every 15 to 20 seconds is it's shutting off those attention nerves and turning on usually what's called the default network, which is a network of neurons that are active when we're not active, okay? And so something to kind of keep in mind when we are being attentive. It's a good reason to take good notes. It's a good reason to go back and listen to audio information and those kinds of things, because we often miss it. The other advice that would be given on the selective attention and sustained attention would to be review your information that you have to remember in different places, different locations. And when you're studying, sometimes it's not good to start with page 1 and go to page 50. Do that for the first time, but then the next time you go back and study, start with page 25 or page 30 or some other page that isn't, you're not going to have that memory for just the beginning and the end, because that's when your attention is at the most, okay? Divided attention is a very interesting topic, I think. It's also the kind of the everyday term for divided attention is multitasking, okay? And some things that we should know. So multitasking is the ability to do more than one activity at one time. All right. And there's some interesting information that we should know that comes out of the cognitive sciences is really when we're multitasking, what we're doing is serial tasking. The ability to divide your attention to two things or two or more things at one time is kind of a myth. What we do is serial tasking, where we pay attention to one stimuli for a couple seconds, the next stimuli for a couple seconds, another stimuli for a couple seconds, and then it tends to blend within our consciousness, and we're thinking that we're doing more than a couple things at the same time. But we'll use the term multitasking, and some things that we should know. I'm always asked who's better at multitasking, men or women, and the myth, or I shouldn't say it's a myth, it's actually a fact. There is factual information that women are better at multitasking, especially for women who come back to the workplace after having a child. And this might kind of give a clue at why women tend to be better at multitasking, because what the people who study this find is that a woman starts in the workforce, performs at a certain level, leaves the workforce, has a child, spends some maternity leave with the child, and then comes back to the workforce, and she has a heightened cognitive ability. She has a better ability to multitask, as an example. And the reason we think this is there's probably some neural wiring that soft wiring in the brain, because if you're a mother and you have an infant, you have to be able to do multiple things at once, because you now have a little human being that is 100% dependent upon you. And therefore, you have to have the ability to shift attention between the infant and everything else that is going on. And we think that bleeds over into returning to the workforce. Now, To be honest, we do have a lot more men who are being single fathers to infants, but I haven't seen any research if men have the same efforts if they take maternity leave and return to the workforce. There hasn't been any research done on that. I think it would be very interesting to see if that applies to men as well, who take maternity leave and engage in the primary care of their infants. I think it would be interesting just to see if is it a gender difference or is it an experience, forced experience that creates that ability? Now, I will tell you that most people who think they're good at multitasking actually suck at it. Other research shows that people who say that they work better when they multitask. For example, in the early days dealing with cell phones and driving, you know, there were people who say they drive better when they're listening to the radio, talking to someone on their cell phone, and you know, putting on their makeup or something like that. Okay, so they're doing multiple things while they're driving, and they do drive better. And of course, you probably all know that theory has been debunked. We actually find people who claim to be master multitaskers make just as many mistakes while driving in driving tests and everything else as people who claim that they don't have good multitasking skills. So just to kind of put that out there, that our multitasking ability is much more dealt with experience, not our attitude towards our ability to do it. Okay. Anything else on the role of attention? Okay. I think that's it on those. All right. So we also know that there's things called shallow processing, intermediate processing, and deep processing. And this really comes down to the kind of things you do when you're in a college class. Are you just kind of skimming through things, which would be kind of shallow processing? Okay, we shallow process all the time when we're walking down a hallway, or because we really don't encode, you know, exactly the pictures we see. But we recognize a lot of times that we walked down the hallway before. Intermediate processing is more what we do when we try to remember a phone number or someone's Snapchat handle. I think that's what they're called. I don't know. I'm old. Or some information like an address. Okay, we're not necessarily really trying to remember it for a very long term, but we want to remember it long enough to do something with it. Okay. And then we have what's called deep processing. Okay. Now, deep processing is when we really intentionally want to learn and remember something. So we really sit down, we really pay attention, and we really work at something. And there's some things interesting with deep processing that I think is fascinating. One, deep processing is it repetitive things. It's not like the learning how to spell words and you spell it 50 times. Okay, that's not deep processing. Okay, deep processing requires a couple things. One, it requires effort. Okay, it requires us to really put energy into it. It's tiring, and that's why a lot of times we don't engage in deep processing. The other issue with deep processing is it's not just memorizing new things, it's connecting information with already stored information in the system. The best way to remember something is to connect it with something you already know. And that's one of the things I like about psychology, because psychology is a study of us, right? And so taking this information and really connecting it with experiences you've already had and the like really is the best way to deep process. And I want to go back to the effort on it, okay? Because there's something that has been promoted over the last 20, 30 years called learning styles. Learning styles being, do you prefer auditory information or visual information or kinesthetic or active types of information? And there was this assumption that what we should do in education is match our learning styles to our students' learning styles. And what we have found is there's been almost 6 meta-analysis done, and a meta-analysis takes all the research in one area and kind of squishes it all together, is that that's not true, okay? If you, for example, prefer auditory learning, your memory is not going to be any better than if you did it visually, for example. In fact, what we have found, and it goes on the deep processing issue, is if you truly want to remember something, you should study it in the opposite of what your preferred learning style is. Not only that, if you really want to capitalize on remembering things, you should do it in multiple modalities. So for this class, you should go read the text on memory. And then maybe you should listen to this lecture again. And then you might want to draw some models or something like that and do it kinesthetically, okay? We find that those two processes is actually what really engages people into learning and doesn't create any false memories. And I think too, when we look at this effortful thing about deep processing, there is also research that has been done on cognitive ability, okay? And in this research, what they did is they took individuals who scored low on IQ tests. So let's say they scored like 80, 70, 90, average being 100, okay? And what they had is 2 different versions of what's called an analogy cognitive test, where you have to read something and then come up with a solution. And usually those solutions are pretty fixed in nature. And what they did in a really interesting research is that they gave one cognitive test in the kind of regular typology, New Times Roman, right? That really easy to read type of font. In another test that they gave people, they made the font one of those really funky, hard to read fonts. And it was really interesting. So the individuals who scored low on cognitive ability and read the easy to read test scored where they were, 80, 70, 90, in that range, just exactly where they were when they originally took an IQ test. What was interesting is the people who took that IQ test with a very difficult font to read, because they actually ended up scoring at 100 or above, the same as what you would consider someone with a normal or above IQ would score on those cognitive tests by reading the harder to read font. And kind of the theory behind this is by reading the more difficult font, the person had to pay more attention to being what is said. They had to create the story and the narrative in their head, and they had to deep process it. And so when we think, we have lower IQs and those kinds of things, usually it's only because our preference for processing information are at the shallow or intermediate level, because we know when we take people who don't think that they're good with cognitive tasks or IQ tasks, and we make those tasks more difficult and require a more deep processing level of encoding, they do a lot better. Okay, so that's something to consider when you're going through your college experience, right? Okay, so again, this is just an example. Shallow processing is the physical and perceptual features of an analyze. So it's noting like lines and angles, contours, you know, such as being able to detect the difference between a car and a motorcycle, but it's not really really saying much. Intermediate processing is stimulus is recognized and labeled. So in this one, you see the lines and the contours of the car. When you're doing intermediate processing, you realize that it's a car, okay? And then deep processing is giving it semantic, meaningful, symbolic characteristics. So associating the connection with a car are brought to mind. You think of the Porsches and the Ferraris you hope to buy and the fun. And so you really connect with that vehicle. Okay. And this is, again, we'll talk about this next week when we get to witness identification. You know, what happens when we put a person in a lineup, and why is it that testimony in a court really shouldn't be trusted, okay? And it really has to do with these different levels of processing, but we'll get to that next week when we talk about witness identification and those kinds of things. Because really, to be able to identify a specific person, a specific place, and the like, you have to do this deep type of processing of the information. And again, this is tiring and exhausting. And most of the time, we don't want to engage in that type of processing. So what are some ways you can, again, increase your ability to make memories and whatnot? One again is elaboration can enhance memory, so connecting it with information that you're aware about. I do want to really quickly, let me think of how to do this. I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute. No, I don't think it's in here. Okay. Give me just a second. Okay, I found. I want to play this video kind of to elaborate on the things that I've been saying about memory and memory systems really quick. Hold on just a sec.